All right, we're ready for Joshua chapter 9 in our study of Joshua. The copier is down, so we don't have questions for next week, which is chapter 10. And so we should have those Sunday, but if perchance we don't, then just read and study Joshua 10 for our next study. Joshua 9 is where we are, and as you're turning there, let's review where we have been in the book of Joshua and where we're going. This little review of our chapters. Chapter 1 was about Joshua prepares for the conquest. Chapter 2 dealt with the spies being sent to Jericho, mapping out what they're going to do, and that's where they met up with Rahab the harlot. Chapter 3 has to do with crossing over the Jordan, the memorial stones in chapter 4, two sets of those, one in the middle of the river and the other that was taken with them to Gilgal. The second generation was circumcised in chapter 6, and then the first of the taking of the cities in the conquest, and we start with the central campaign, we'll see that in a moment, was the taking of the city of Jericho. There was the defeat at Ai as they attempted to take Ai in chapter 7. And then last week we talked about the victory at Ai when they decided then they're going to do it according to God's plan. 3 sections to the book. Chapters 1 through 5 is crossing the river. The next section, chapters 6 through 12, has to do with conquering the enemy. That's where we are. And then there's the claiming of the inheritance. In the conquering of the enemy, there are 3 campaigns, and then there is a list of defeated kings. And we are in the central campaign, and then we'll go to the south and then to the north. And that we'll map out as we get next week to chapter 10. So we're in the central campaign. So what's happened thus far as we start into chapter 9 is Jericho has been defeated, and so has Ai been defeated. Even though there was a setback, Ai has been defeated. So they've taken Jericho and Ai, and so other cities are in their eye for the future. So let's see what happens in chapter 9. Question number 1 is give a short summary of chapter 9. That would be the same as our title for chapter 9. This is a treaty with the Gibeonites. A treaty with the Gibeonites. We'll talk about where Gibeon was in its proximity to Gilgal, which is kind of home base for Joshua at the moment. But here are the 4 things that happen in chapter 9. Kings on the west of Jordan form an alliance, verses 1 and 2. And then we're going to see the men of Gibeon deceive Israel and make a covenant with Israel. And the third thing is that Israel learns that they have been deceived. And then fourth and finally, we have Joshua makes them woodcutters and water carriers. Now, let's start with this first. They're actually in Joshua chapter 2, what we have are 2 different efforts to deal with Israel. That is, the cities around in this central area or throughout Palestine, not just the central area, let me back up to say throughout Palestine. The cities in that central area or in that region of Palestine come together, and the kings within that, realizing that a king wasn't a king over a whole region, but perhaps over a city, like the king of Jericho or the king of Ai or the king of a couple of cities. So here we have the kings of this region is the one effort to deal with it, and then the Gibeonites have another effort to deal with Israel. So the fame of Israel has spread. The word has spread all through the region. What's happened to Og, to Sihon, what happened even in Egypt, and what's happened to Jericho, what's happened at Ai, and everybody's getting the idea that they're after us next. So something's got to be done. So here's the first effort. The kings on the west side of Jordan form an alliance. And so notice who they are. Let's start at verse 1 of Joshua chapter 9. It came to pass when all the kings who were on this side, that would be, this side has reference to the west, of Jordan in the hills and in the lowlands, that is along the coast of the Great Sea toward Lebanon. And then he mentions the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, Hivite, and Jebusite. They heard of it. They gathered together to fight Joshua with one accord. Joshua and Israel with one accord. Well, this is a map we've looked at several times, and we have various nations of people or groups of people, such as the Hittites and the Amalekites and the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites. and the general region where they were. But basically, the kings that were scattered throughout Palestine decide that they seem to take Ai, and they did take Ai and they took Jericho. Maybe if we all band together and form an alliance and fight together and pool our armies together, then we're going to be able to fight against. We'll see more about that starting in chapter 10 a little bit later. But that's all that's said about that here in chapter 9, that this is an effort to deal with Israel and to deal with Joshua. And I think the reason for that is found later in verse 9 concerning the fame that had spread. All right, let's go to the second point in the chapter. And this is really what the chapter is all about, and that is this treaty with the Gibeonites. And so the men of Gibeon, they deceive Israel and they make a covenant. So let's see what happens here. Question number 2 for tonight, we've already answered, but not formally. Who formed the alliance against Joshua and Israel? That was the kings that were west of Jordan. So now we're ready to deal with verses 3 to 13. In 3 to 13, these men of Gibeon pretended to be from a far country. And let's see what they did, what they said, and what happens here. When the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai. Now, who were the people of Gibeon? Well, let's get ahead here on a map. And Gibeon, if you look inside this circle, there's watch my arrow right here. Here's Gilgal. That's home base. And over here is Gibeon. Some suggest and there's different measurements that have been given because it's such a hilly country. But that would be quite a trip to make overnight from one to the other because of the amount of climb that you'd have to go. But probably about 20 miles. Some say as little as 15 and some say 25. So we're going to go with an average of 25. Young folks, you've got a question about that. About 20 miles is how far that was. And so they're close by. They're not from a far, far country. They're close by here. You see where Ai was. Here is Ai within the middle of the circle right there. And so Ai is not far from Gibeon. So they're close by. And so they came from Gibeon, it says, and when they heard what had happened at Ai, they're thinking that we're next on his list. Well, I don't know who was next on the list, but they must have been thinking we're close to being next on the list. If they took Jericho, then Ai, and Gibeon is over here, then perhaps we're next on the list. And they seem to have some knowledge of what God had said to the children of Israel through Moses. And if they did, then they knew that God had told them to utterly destroy and wipe out the people. And so they're thinking, we don't stand a chance. So let's see what they do. Beginning at verse 4, they worked craftily, and they pretended to be ambassadors, and they took old sacks on their donkeys and old wineskins that were torn and mended, and old and patched sandals on their feet and garments, etc. Took their provisions that were dry and moldy. In other words, they started out making it look like, trying to make it look like they've been on the road for a long time. And so they found some old moldy bread, and so it looks like they've been traveling since it was fresh, and they say that a little bit later. They get old worn out sandals, and they take sacks that are old and torn and tattered and put them on their donkeys, and so it looks like they have been perhaps traveling for a long time. So they went to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, about 20 miles, and they go over, that's where home base is for Joshua. And they said to him, we've come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. Well, that's kind of a strange request. Because if they came up and said, I say strange because if they came up and said, hey, we're from Gibeon over here and we want to make a covenant with you, meaning we want to make a treaty with you where you'll spare our lives and not kill us. We know you're marching through and we've heard you're killing all the people. And your God had told you to do that through Moses, and we want you to make a covenant with us. Joshua would not have done that. So we've come from a country. We want you to make a covenant with us. There was a little suspicion here as we see at verse 9, or verse 7 rather, not verse 9, but verse 7. But they say we're from a far country. The country is never identified. Perhaps this is a summary, and I take that it is. And they may have identified some far country, and it's not identified for us, but it may have been to Joshua. Or they may have just said a far country, and that would be insignificant. We're just from a far country away from here. we're from a foreign country. Not anything around here. We're not a part of this region. That's basically all they're trying to say. At verse 7 now, the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you dwell among us. How can we make a covenant with you? Now, what does that mean? The New Living Translation translates that perhaps you live nearby. There was some suspicion, perhaps. Y'all may be deceiving us. And you might just live right here in the neighborhood, meaning in one of the cities close by, and you might be deceiving us. And so why should we make a covenant? We're supposed to be, and I'm adding to that a little bit, but paraphrase, we're supposed to be wiping out and killing all the people of the land. And if we make a covenant with you, then we're going against the principle of what we're setting out to do. So the wording of verse 7 is quite interesting. Perhaps you dwell among us. And then how can we, there's no way we can make a covenant with you if you're in the neighborhood here and you're close by. You might live close by. You might live among us. You might live nearby, as the New Living Translation so translates that. And they were nearby. They're 20 miles away, 25 at the most. And so they said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said, well, who are you and where are you from? And so they said, well, from a very far country. And now notice the lies they begin to tell. Number one is, we're from a very far country. That's lie number one. And because of the name of the Lord your God, Wiersbe's suggesting, I think he's wrong about this, that they're saying we come in the name of your God. I don't think they were saying. If that is what they're saying, then that would be a lie. They're not coming in the name of the Lord. But they're saying we come because of the name of your God. For, here's why they say that. For we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt. Now that's true. They had heard of that. And all that he did to the two kings on the other side. And I'll come back to that. I want to get ahead to the lies. Drop down to verse 11. Therefore the elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, lie number 2, they told us to take provisions for your journey and go meet with them and say, we are your servants. Nobody had told them that. Maybe they had been told to do that, but they had not been told to be ambassadors because they're not from a foreign country. Lie number 3, verse 12, and this bread of ours we took hot for our provisions. This old moldy bread, it was hot. It was fresh when we left home. And look how moldy it is. We've been on the road for a long time. And look now, it's dry and moldy. And the wineskins were filled with new fresh wine, and look, they're torn, and our garments and our sandals are all wore out. And so here's your evidence that we've been on the journey for a long time. And so you can look around and see the molded bread. You can see their sandals are worn out. You can see their wineskins are old and tattered, and the sacks on the donkeys are old and worn out. Pretty strong evidence that they're from a foreign country. Let's go back now to see what they said about what they have heard. I want to suggest to you as a practical thing, perhaps their faith was stronger than the faith of some of the Israelites. Now, why would I say that? Well, they had heard about what God had done. They had heard what had been done in Egypt. They had heard what had been done to the two kings of the Amorites, that is, on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og. And notice what they did not mention. They didn't mention what had been done to Jericho and Ai. Why? Well, I don't know for sure, but it would seem like that is part of the deception. If they say, we've heard what's happened to Ai and Jericho, that would suggest that news had got to them pretty quick. That news would not have got to them in a far, far country. So they act ignorant of that. Another evidence that we're from a far country as Joshua's listening, because they've mentioned our successes, but they didn't mention the last two. They must be from a far country. They must be. So they didn't mention that at all. Now, let's finish our observations about 13, then we'll go back to our questions. Well, I want to go back to this thing about their faith. Their faith seems to be stronger in some sense than the children of Israel because they had heard about God. They had heard about what God had done in Egypt. They had heard about what God had done with Og and Sihon. And they had also, though they didn't mention it, heard what happened at Ai and at Jericho. And that made them fearful, and they knew that God could do the same thing against them. When it comes to the children of Israel, they didn't even consult with God over the matter. And we'll get to that at verse 13 and 14 here in a minute. But their faith seems to be even stronger, perhaps, than was the faith of the children of Israel. Now let's get some questions out of our way about 3 to 13. Adult questions. Number 3 is what did the men of Gibeon do to Israel? They deceived them, said they were from a far country. Question 1 for the graded ages, where were the men from? That came to Joshua. They were from Gibeon. And question 3, what did the men of Gibeon say that they had heard about God? And they had heard what God had done in Egypt, what he had done against Og and against Sihon. All right. Now let's look at 14 and 15, 2 verses together. One of the high points, I don't mean high points in the sense of it's a moral highness, but it's an important point that Joshua and the rulers made a covenant with them, verses 14 and 15, and why they did that. Look at verse 14. Then the men of Israel took some of the provisions, but they did not ask counsel from the Lord. These men had brought some provisions, and the children of Israel took that, but you might underline, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. Now, should they have asked counsel of the Lord? And I think obviously you always ask counsel of the Lord. You always, what does the Lord want us to do? How does the Lord want me to act? What's the Lord's will on this question? What does the Lord want me to do? There are 2 things about that. They had a means of doing that. Numbers 27 and 21 shows they had the Urim and the Thummim. How did the Urim and Thummim work? I don't know all the details of that, nor do I need to know. I just know it was a means of communicating and receiving answer from God. So they had Urim and Thummim with a high priest who could have consulted with God and found out exactly where these men who they're supposed to be, are these men men we are to agree with. What should we make a covenant with these men? They had that. But even without that, let's suppose the Urim and Thummim had been rejected and it's gone. They still were forbidden to make covenants with strangers. Exodus 34, verses 12 and 13. So Joshua should have known that they were not to make a covenant with them. The children of Israel should have known they were not to make a covenant with them. They had a means of consulting with the Lord, and they still made a covenant with them. Now, why did they make a covenant with them? They made a covenant with them, and we'll get to the covenant, verse 15, in a moment, because they had been deceived. It wasn't just that these men came and said, we're from a foreign country. But there was evidence, and I put evidence in quotation, that was presented that was deceptive. They presented the evidence of moldy bread. They presented the evidence of torn sacks, dirty sandals, garments that were worn out, and deceptive speech, because they mentioned, we've heard of this, we've heard of this, we've heard of this, but they obviously they failed to mention a couple of things that would have given it away. And so they had been deceived, which we know they did. But my point is that the reason they made a covenant and didn't seek the counsel of the Lord, they fell for the deception. Now, here's a practical thing. Just because someone supposedly presents evidence of a view doesn't mean that view is correct. There is a difference in evidence and interpretation of evidence. The evolutionists have all kinds of evidence. They have evidence that the world is billions of years old, but there's a difference in that evidence and interpretation of that evidence. My illustration of that is, here's a person that's accused of killing someone else in court, and the evidence is, here's the gun that killed the individual. Everybody agrees that's the gun that killed him, and this person's fingerprints are on the gun. Well, that's the evidence. The interpretation of the evidence is a different thing. One side interprets the evidence, he pulled the trigger and killed him. The other is, he owned the gun and it was stolen from him, and that's why his fingerprints were there. So there's another explanation for his fingerprints. Well, there's another explanation for the bread being moldy. They started out with moldy bread. There's another explanation for them not mentioning Ai and Jericho, is because they're trying to deceive. There's another explanation for their worn-out sandals. They started out with worn-out sandals. So just because evidence is presented doesn't mean that evidence proves the point that's trying to be made. There's a difference in evidence and interpretation of evidence. Make sense? All right. Practical thing to learn right here in this context. So verse 15, because they had been deceived, Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them. So Joshua and the leaders made a pact with them, made an agreement, made a treaty. We're not going to kill you. We're not going to do that at all. All right. Now let's move to the third section. Israel learns that they'd been deceived. Now, 16 and 17 now. They learned it when they came to their cities. Look at verse 16. It happened at the end of 3 days. Grady Dages, you've got a question. How long? Here's your answer. It happened at the end of 3 days after they'd made a covenant with them that they heard they were neighbors who dwelt near them. Come to find out they're not but just 20 miles down the road. Said they're from a foreign country. They weren't that far away. Well, the children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities the third day. And here's the cities of that region. There was Gibeon, Chephiram, Beeroth, and Kirjath-jearim. You see those that are highlighted on the map before you. And they're close in their proximity to Jericho over here. And Gilgal's just a little ways from that, which is not on that map there. All right. Now, what I want you to, it's not what I'm wanting. I want to go back. Here we go. They learned it when they came to their cities. Now look at verse 17, verse 18 now. Verse 18 said, the people of Israel began to mourn. In other words, they are disappointed when they find out they've been deceived. When the children of Israel did not, but the children of Israel did not attack them. That is, here they're making their way. So seemingly, Gibeon and these cities that we just mentioned on the map here were next on their list. In other words, the assumption of the Gibeonites was correct, that we're coming, this seems to be the way they're coming right toward us next. So they come to Gibeon, they come to the cities that were close in proximity to Gibeon, and the children of Israel did not attack them because the rulers had sworn by the Lord God of Israel, and all the congregation murmured against the rulers. So the people began to murmur and complain. I thought we were supposed to be wiping them out and killing them all, and you're telling us not to kill them now. Why is that? Well, look at verses 19 to 21. 19 to 21. All the rulers said to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the word of the God of Israel, therefore we may not touch them. Now, there's something practical to be learned here. They gave their word. We made a covenant, we made a promise to them, we told them we wouldn't kill them, and we're not going to kill them. Even though we were deceived, even though we could say this was based upon deception and therefore we ought to be out of our covenant with them, we made a covenant, we gave our word, we're going to keep our word. So we're not going to touch them. And so this we will do to them, verse 20, we will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore to them. In the mind of the leaders of Israel, it was just as important to keep the word they had uttered and the covenant and the oath they had made as it would have been to have killed the people based upon the direction of God. Let's go further. Let's get verse 21. We'll come back to that point. And so the ruler said, let them live and let them be woodcutters and carriers for the congregation as the rulers had promised Israel. Now, several writers have mentioned, at least some of them have mentioned Psalm 15 in this connection. Doesn't directly talk about this, but it talks about one making a promise and keeping his word. Psalm 15 and 4 talks about the man who walks upright and the man who is the guest of God. It's the one who swears to his own hurt and does not change. What does that mean? He gives his word, he made a promise, even if it's to his disadvantage, and it ends up being to his own harm, he keeps his word. His word means something. He said he will, and he will. He said he won't, and he won't. He's a person of his word. He swears to his own hurt, and he keeps his word. All right? The same principle found right here. This was to their own hurt. They're going to have the Gibeonites at their back door here that they're spared, that they should have destroyed, but they promised they wouldn't destroy him, so we're not going to destroy him. We're going to do something with him, but we're not going to destroy him. So they keep their word. More about that here in just a moment. So now let's move to the last section. And here's what Joshua does with them. I'm trying to make some time. We'll finish our questions, and I want to get to some practical application here from all of this here in just a second. So here's what happens in 22 to 27, is that Joshua makes them woodcutters and water carriers, is what he does with them. So let's see what these verses say and what we can add to that that may not be mentioned here in the text, some other references. Joshua called for them and spoke to them and said, "Why have you deceived us, saying we're from a far country?" And they said, he said, "Now therefore you're cursed, and none of you shall be freed from being slaves." Graded Ages, you've got to question, what did Joshua do with them? He just made them slaves, is what he made them. And you're going to be water carriers and woodcutters and water carriers for the house of God. Now let's stop there and talk about who these people are and what they were later called. These same people are later called Nethinims. You'll come across them in other places. For example, let's turn over to 1 Chronicles. We've got time to do this. We're going to finish a little early, I think, anyway. So 1 Chronicles chapter 9, and 1 Chronicles chapter 9 and in verse 2. If I can get my pages separated here. Yeah, 1 Chronicles chapter 9 and in verse 2 talks about all the first inhabitants who dwelt in possessions in their cities were Israelites, priests, Levites, and the Nethinim. That seems to be the same group of people that were the Gibeonites who had been made slaves of the children of Israel. And so they're going to be woodcutters and water carriers. They're Nethinims. They're, some refer to them as temple bondsmen, temple servants. Notice another reference. In the post-exile period, let's go to the book of Ezra. Ezra chapter 2 and verse 43. And if you might want to make a reference at these passages, we're going to mention 2 verses in Ezra and 1 in Nehemiah. And I'll give these references again that make a reference back to Joshua 9 as being the passage where this is the beginning. We read of the people who helped build the wall, and I mean who came back in this second group. We'll talk about building the wall in a moment, chapter 3 of Nehemiah. But it says the Nethinims, and it talks about the beings, the sons of, and who their family are. That is the same group, seemingly, of Joshua 9, same group of, or same family. Look at verse 58, same context. Verse 58, it talks about all the Nethinims and the children of Solomon's servants who made 192. So there's the Nethinims mentioned again. Let me give you one more reference where the Nethinims are mentioned. Nehemiah 3 and 26. Nehemiah 3:26. This is where they're rebuilding the wall and who built where and who built from this gate to that gate. And at verse 26, moreover, the Nethinim who dwelt in Ophel made repairs as far as the place of the front of the water gate, etc. So those references again, 1 Chronicles 9 and verse 2, Ezra chapter 2, verse 43 and 58, and Nehemiah 3:26. So going in reverse order, Nehemiah 3:26, Ezra 2:43 and 58, and 1 Chronicles 9 and verse 2. That seems to be the same woodcutters and water carriers. Now let's finish that, beginning at verse 24 now, back in Joshua 9. So Joshua said, because you have told your servants that the Lord your God commanded his servant, so they answered to Joshua, and here's their explanation. Now looking at it through their eyes, you can't blame them for doing this. Keep in mind, they are heathens who don't really serve the one true living God. Lying and being deceptive is not an issue. That's not a problem, like it would be serving the one true living God. So all they're trying to do is spare their lives. So here's what they said. It was certainly told your servants that the Lord God commanded his servant Moses to give you the land. We heard about that God told Moses that they could have all the land and destroy all the inhabitants of the land. Well, that was true. And we were very much afraid for our lives because of you, and have done this thing. So we deceived you and had you to make a covenant with us to spare our lives, and that's exactly what you did. So our lives are spared. Better to be a bond servant, better to be a water carrier and a woodcutter than to be killed. So you can't blame them for that. So he did to them and delivered to them out of the hand of the children of Israel so that they didn't kill them, and he made them woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation for the altar in the place where he would choose even to this day. So wherever the temple service or the tabernacle service was, they were made woodcutters and water carriers. All right. Before we look at those practical things, let's finish questions out. Let's go over the graded ages first. Question 4, what did Israel fail to do when the men came? They failed to ask counsel of God. Question 5, what agreement did Joshua make with the Gibeonites? To not kill them. Question 6, should have been 3 days. How long was it till they found out? It was 3 days later they found out. When they march over and come to the cities, then they see, oh, this is where they're from. And it was time for it to be revealed at that point, because if they didn't and killed those people, they had to let it be known. No, this is where we're actually from. You just made a covenant with these people. And so it was time to let the secret out. And then the last question for the graded ages is, what did Joshua do with the Gibeonites? He made them slaves. Question number 7 for the adults is, what did Israel, who did Israel not attack, and why? That is, why did they not attack them? It's because they gave their word, and they were not to go back on their word. And then question number 8 is, what did Joshua do with them? Made them woodcutters and water carriers. Let's look at some practical things here, and we may stop a minute or two early. Here's some practical things from this chapter. So let's see what they are. One of the saddest things in the chapter was they didn't seek counsel of the Lord. Had they stopped and said, okay, let's use the Urim and Thummim and let's consult God. Or let's stop and think about, could these men be someone that we ought to make a covenant with? And they didn't just ask the counsel of God. And so there's some practical things we learn from that. We do that in a number of things. Maybe about dealing with our friends. And we don't take time to consult the counsel of God. How should I deal with this? What decision should I make? Maybe it's in raising our children. We make our decisions how we're going to discipline and raise our children without consulting the counsel of God. Maybe it's about whether the marriage is scriptural. We don't consult counsel from God. Maybe it's how to treat one another. We don't stop and consult the counsel of God. Maybe it's how we should treat our parents. And we do what our peers are doing rather than consult the counsel of God. Maybe how we should deal with those who walk disorderly. Or maybe the kind of clothes we should wear. And on we could go with application. We don't consult the counsel of God. And that's the point being made here. They did not ask the counsel of the Lord. Here's a second thing. We can easily be deceived and misled. Here were people that should have known better and should have consulted the counsel of God, had every reason they should have known not to make a covenant with the Gibeonites, and they were easily deceived because evidence, and I put that in quotations, was supplied. Another lesson that we learn is keep your promise or your word means nothing. You see, when Joshua says, we're not going to kill you, and then they come to Gibeon and they said, well, this is where we're from. Yeah, we lied to you, but this is where we come. Even though they had lied, Joshua was not going to lie. He had given his word. He'd given his promise. Your word means something. If you say you're going to, then do it. If you say you're not, then don't. Be a person of your word. Let your yes be yes. By the way, in connection with that, James chapter 5 and in verse 12, but above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no, no. In other words, your yes should mean yes and your no should mean no. Your word should mean something. We could go on about that, but let's go to the next one. Consequences to misleading others. Because they didn't mislead others, they weren't just spared, but they were made servants and made slaves. Joshua put them in a service role rather than just sparing their lives and letting them mingle with people. Faith was based upon testimony. That's interesting. They did not see, that is, we're talking about the Gibeonites now. There's no evidence that any of them were there and saw what had happened in Egypt, or that they were on the other side of the river and had seen what had happened to Og and Sihon. They had heard that by testimony, and they believed that testimony, and they had faith that that was true. If they didn't believe that was true, then why are they trying to make a covenant with Israel? So faith here is based upon testimony. What faith they had was based upon testimony. Well, here's another practical thing. The greatest enemy is not always obvious. You see, from the standpoint of Joshua and the children of Israel, the enemies are the nations here in the area, right around us here, all this neighborhood. That's the ones that we need to be fighting. And so let's make a covenant with these people from a foreign country. And the most dangerous enemy was the one that really wasn't all that obvious. It was their closest neighbor who had just deceived them. And that could happen with us as well. And the last one here mentioned is the enemy knows God's word and will use it. They know exactly the history of God. They knew exactly what had happened with Og and with Sihon and in Egypt. They also knew what happened at Jericho and Ai. And they used that against the children of Israel. They knew. They knew what Moses had said about killing the people. And seemingly Joshua and the children of Israel had forgotten about that for just a little bit. All right. We're going to stop about 5 minutes early, but we're done. And so we will stop right